Hello, everyone. This is Rick, and welcome to Astral Club. Today's episode is going to be communicating with lost loved ones. I'm going to talk about some signs that are common that your loved one is seeking to communicate with you. Two, I'll then detail some experiences that I've had and one that my wife had, and one that I was sent a few years back by a young woman. And I think you'll gain some interesting knowledge from those experiences. And then finally, I'm going to end with just some warnings that you should be aware of if you're going to attempt to contact a loved one who has passed from the physical onto the astral plane. First, I just want to give a little shout out, though, to Alina, whose last name I am not going to butcher. uh, she had her first astral projection last week, and I have it pinned at the beginning of last week's episode about the undersea UFO. So I just want to give a shout out to Alina. Congratulations. And I'm getting info from people all the time saying they're now beginning to astral project. So that's great. That's precisely the purpose of this channel, to help people astral project and to let them know what to expect and how to get the most of the astral projection experience. Okay, let's start with some of the signs that you might look for, or you might observe here in the physical, that lets you know that perhaps a past loved one is seeking to communicate. One of the most popular ones, and this appears in my wife's experience, is dreams concerning your loved ones, where they pop up in your dreams and perhaps communicate with you or what have you. That can be a sign that they are seeking to interact with you on some level, to pass along their love or a message, or just to say hi. Number two, light bulbs or candles flickering. Light bulbs flickering, it's been my experience that the astral body has some electromagnetic properties. So it's not surprising that it might be possible to affect electronics in some way if someone who has passed is concentrating on expending energy to do so. As far as the candles are concerned, those can be caused to flicker just through some changing temperatures, which happens sometimes when there's those who've passed in an area, or perhaps just a breeze that was created by the changing temperatures. Um, Another one is electronic devices continually reboot. Maybe your computer, it's time to be replaced, but maybe it's being affected on some level by someone trying to communicate. Once again, you've got an electronic device here that is being affected in some way, shape, or form. And while we're talking about this, I don't know if I've ever shared this, but talking about healing, and we'll probably have a healing episode at some point, but I remember I had a laptop that was failing. So what I did is, when I projected out of my body, I took my astral hands, put it inside the laptop, and pushed energy into it. Well, the next morning when I started it up, it was working fine, and it's still working. So it's kind of interesting, about that whole electromagnetic situation and its effect on electronics. Another symptom that has been passed down through the centuries, as a fact, is you catch a scent perhaps a scent of a particular type of perfume that your grandmother, or your maybe some aftershave that your grandfather used to wear, and you catch a scent of it. That can sometimes be a sign that they're seeking contact. Another one is clocks keep stopping. Once again, perhaps some sort of electromagnetic energy was causing that. Another one, which is interesting, is catching the same song over and over again. I'm not exactly sure how this might happen, but perhaps the person trying to contact you is subtly influencing you to turn to certain channels at certain times so that you'll hear that same song over again. We just talked about this a second ago, but sudden changes in temperature, small shifts of air can indicate the presence of someone. And now, any one of those things that I just described can be explained in a variety of ways. Just because your computer reboots or perhaps the light bulb is blinking, maybe just means you need a new computer, or maybe that light bulb has been in the socket for too long and maybe you should break down and put a new one in. But these are some of the signs that if you start noticing it, could be an indication that a loved one is seeking some contact. Okay, let's go on to my experiences. My grandmother passed over when I was in high school. She was a lovely woman, and I couldn't say enough nice things about her. She was just beautiful. Never would say a bad word about anyone. Always had positive things to say. It was just a loving place to visit. She, in the last years of her life, was suffering from breast cancer. She was living with my uncle, and she finally passed one night. That night, she visited me while I was in that in-between state between leaving my body, and she just said that she had passed over and that she would miss me and hope to see me again. And that was, other than a personal message, that was the visitation. The next morning, when I awoke, my mother told me that my grandmother had passed on that past night. Of course, I already knew, so it wasn't a surprise to me. Of course, I was stricken with grief, and to this day, I just don't know why I didn't seek out more contact, because the first 30 days or so is generally the best time to contact your past loved one. Those first 30 days when they've passed over, they're in an in-between state, and it's usually a little bit easier, a lot easier, to gain some contact with them. However, I don't know, perhaps it was grief, I don't know, it just didn't occur to me. When it finally did occur to me some months later that, wow, why don't I try to seek her out? I went to the astral plane and encountered a guardian because I was trying to get to the plane. I was concentrating. I want to go to the plane where my grandmother is. And I had that firmly locked in my head. But I was on my way there when I was firmly and completely brought to a stop. And there, a guardian told me that my grandmother was in a recuperative plane and that she couldn't be disturbed, and that living people, most especially, were not permitted in that particular subplane. So that was, the sum total of my attempt to contact her on the astral. After that, I decided it might be best to move on with my life and allow her to move on with what she needed to do. My wife's father passed a number of years ago, and he was just an amazing man. Uh, he was successful in business, was a successful officer in the Air Force, raised three great kids. I could go on and on, but he passed suddenly. It was very quick. So my wife had no chance to say goodbye or indeed any of the other children. So I decided to astral project, about a couple of weeks, I would say, after he had passed. And I went to an astral mock up of the house that he had grown up in. And there, even though it was not Christmas, the whole place was decked out for Christmas. And there I saw his two parents, who I had known before they had passed, but two other people who I did not recognize, and who when describing them to my wife, they were his grandparents, who had passed long before I was certainly on the scene. And if there was one thing that my wife's father really enjoyed, was Christmas. In his house, Christmas was always magical. I mean, he would do it up with the lights and with these Christmas train sets and decorations, and that was just the number one thing that he really just loved. So, at that stage of the game, he was sharing this, and I just went there and I just said hi and I smiled, and he said he was okay, and he had a big smile on his face and was just enjoying being with his parents and with his grandparents again, celebrating this Christmas experience. So, I told that to my wife, and it was of some comfort to her. There's another experience that was involving my wife when she was pregnant with my daughter, who you've met. She's a physician's assistant, and she was in one episode. Her name is Rose, and when she was pregnant with my daughter, her mother came to her in what my wife describes as an extremely realistic and tactile dream. And she tried to tell her mother that, what was going on with the family, with her other brothers, and how they had children. But her mother wanted her to know that she was there for her, to support her in this mothering experience, and how she then extended her hands and placed them on my wife's womb, just to show that she was there and that there was very real support for her daughter now that she was going through the pregnancy and soon the birth experience. A few years ago, I was contacted by a young woman. She was in her mid-20s, as I recall, and she came from a conservative, religious type background. She had a boyfriend who she had been dating for a number of years, and they had just become engaged, and she had just started planning her wedding. When she told me this story, apparently her grandmother, who was also a very, very conservative, very religious woman, who they were very close in life. She taught her how to sew, and they just had a wonderful, wonderful relationship. Well, this woman passed, and this young woman happened to be able to astral project, and so she astral projected to her grandmother, or and let me say grandmother, let me put that in those air quotes. And this grandmother looked very much like her grandmother, gave her some very odd advice. She said that her grandmother, who, as I said, was married to her grandfather for 50 years, they had been happy and whatever. She said this grandmother said to her that, geez, what she should be doing and what she wishes she could have done is, jump on every boy and young man that she could possibly find. Don't get married and just experience life that way and just have a lot of different men in your life. And when she returned, she was troubled. She was, had valued her grandmother's input, and now she was confronted with this very serious, very odd advice. And so she came to me and said, I'm rethinking my life now. Should I not get married, and should I follow, this my grandmother's advice? I said, well, it's not for me to advise you on either of those things. I can't tell you whether that was really your grandmother for sure, and I certainly can't advise you on how to live your life. But I said, if you mind, let me ask you a couple of questions. And she said, fine. And I said, did that advice sound like something that your grandmother would have said to you? And she said, oh, no, that was completely against my grandmother and her morals and the way she lived her life. It was completely out of character for her. Then I asked her, too, was this advice against her own personal moral code? She said it most definitely was. And she was indeed deeply in love with her intended, and she had been looking forward to getting married. So I said to her, there are beings on the astral plane who enjoy being malicious or being mischievous. They can sometimes take on the forms of loved ones. I told her that as an experienced astral projector, I have done that for positive reasons to give comfort to people. So that if it doesn't feel right to you, if this advice goes against everything you knew about your loved one and everything that you stand for, is that really some advice that you think you should follow? Well, she answered her own question, and she had ended up communicating with me about a year later saying that she was not happily married, and she was happy that we'd been able to speak. Remember, as I say, as above, so below. When somebody tells you something here on the physical plane, and I don't care who they are or who they portray themselves to be, you should always take their words, their advice, with a grain of salt. Meaning, like what Ronald Reagan used to say, President Ronald Reagan, trust but verify. Don't take anything at face value. People can fool you here. They can lie to you here in the physical plane. And on the astral, most especially in the lower astral planes, there are plenty of folks there who can fool you and can lie to you. And it is even possible for them to counterfeit the appearance of a loved one. So, you still have to use your own common sense and stick to your own moral code and realize that not everything we see here in the physical, just like everything we see on the astral, may not be 100% what it appears to be. So you still have to use your own good judgment. Okay, with that particular example, I'd like to get into just some warnings about this experience. And this is just part of just doing your own due diligence. We were just talking about what I call the fakers. Understand that just because you see some being that you think is Albert Einstein or that you think is a loved one, you can listen to them, you can talk with them, but always have a little bit of doubt in the back of your head, because it is possible for people to counterfeit the appearance of others. And so if you're offered information or advice that doesn't pass the smell test, then perhaps take it with a grain of salt. The next one here is obsession. There's nothing wrong if you have the ability to astral project to say goodbye to a loved one. However, that's the main purpose of visiting loved ones on the astral plane, to say goodbye to them, wish them well, and as they wish you well. When someone passes and goes to the astral plane, they have work to do. My grandmother had to heal. There are others who have to go through lessons. They have to review what they did right, what they've done wrong, what they would change, and perhaps reincarnate and decide how they want to do that. People here in the physical, we have our lives. We have family, we have loved ones here. We have jobs, we have hobbies, we have all manner of things that we have to do and we have to learn here. Now, there is a separation between the physical and the astral. And there's a reason for that. Because each one of these planes has different goals, and the people there have to pursue those goals. For a physical person to become obsessed with contacting someone who's passed on, not only can they potentially sabotage their own physical life and their own goals, but you can also delay the achievement of goals of that person who has passed on. It is not the business of people who are in the astral to become obsessed with someone in the physical any more than it is the business of somebody in the physical to become obsessed with someone in the astral who has passed on. The purpose of this video and of contacting is to say goodbye and to wish them well. But understand that you'll see them again, but now is not the time to try to become obsessed. I met one young man who was actually contemplating suicide because he had become so obsessed with contacting this person. And the person he was contacting actually started advising him, look, you need to stop trying to talk to me. This is doing you no good, and it's delaying my own progress as well. I'm glad he came to me and I was able to convince him to let it go, that he had a life here and now that he had to live, and that he needed to get about that and to start living that. Wisdom. Understand that just because someone passes over, they don't suddenly gain the knowledge of the universe. The person who you loved, who just passed over a few weeks ago, is still essentially that same person. They may have met some people, they may have learned a few things that expanded their horizons a little bit, but they have not suddenly gained ultimate wisdom. So, you shouldn't think of them as now having the wisdom of the universe. It's still pretty much the same person who you used to know. So, put that in perspective. Lastly, I've always advised people to stay away from those spirit or those ghost boxes. Not for the reason that some people give. I don't think you're going to become, possessed or anything. I just think they're a huge waste of time. The people that will speak through those ghost boxes are useless. They're idiots. They're troublemakers, they're ne'er-do-wells. They're the type of people who, if you're listening to this channel, you most likely wouldn't bother with in the physical. So why all of a sudden, now that they've shed their physical body, why all of a sudden would you want to sit there for hours trying to get little snippets of what these idiots have to say for themselves? It's just a giant waste of time. And if you're looking for your loved one to come through there, it's just, I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's just not a very practical way. I mean, what you're going to have is just a crowd of very lower astral entities who are lost, troubled, insane, knuckleheads, you name it. I've seen videos where people spend hours and hours and hours every day sorting through this nonsense, and I just see it as a colossal waste of time. And that's my opinion. You're allowed to disagree if you want. Anyway, that is the episode. So those are some of the signs that someone is trying to communicate with you. Some of my experiences and those of my wife and that young woman who contacted me, and a few warnings that you should be aware of if you're going to try to contact someone who has passed over into the astral. So I hope this will be helpful to some people. And this has been Rick, and as always, I will see you on the astral plane.